You may be muted, Paul. Yes, you are.
There, I think maybe if I get unmuted, it'll work better.
Yes, usually it does.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends, brothers and sisters, extended family in large measure. I very much appreciate that on this cold January evening that some of you have forfeited the Iowa caucus to be on the forum, and most of you are forfeiting the playoff game with the Eagles and Buccaneers. Probably we can get the tail end of that anyway. But the fact that we've chosen to be together again in this ongoing sequence of people giving presentations on issues related to the Book of Mormon gives me pleasure. And this evening, especially because our presenter is Brian Stubbs. Most of you will remember, or some of you will remember, that he gave us two sessions a long year ago on the basic introduction to linguistics, and then sharing the 300 or so Semitic Uto-Aztecan fascicular cognates, I would call them, that he had found, because he comes to us with a PhD background in the Semitic languages, particularly emphasizing the Hebrew, I think. And then he has been a teacher of English and linguistics at the College of Eastern Utah and San Juan campus. And so has MA in linguistics from the University of Utah. And I think that's where he did his PhD study as well. Two of his books that I have, Morsels for the Mind and Change in Languages from Nephi to Now, offer very informational and thinking skills challenges that I want to highly recommend on this forum. He is among the leading publishers of articles on the Uto-Aztecan language family in linguistic journals. And his wife, Sylvia, who is, if I recall, of Hispanic background from South America. So he and I have shared the commonality of cross-cultural marriage. They have 5 children too, and so I'm pleased that we share a number of commonalities. He returns to update his research on the fascicular cognates tying the Semitic and the Uto-Aztecan language families. And so I request that you welcome him and ask all kinds of good questions after his presentation. At this point, let me invite you to pray together. Creator of the echoes through which we apprehend the word, whose voice resonates through the multiverse, its thunders, its whispers, through spiritual vibrancy to be heard, whose spirit calls us together on this Book of Mormon Perspectives forum on Zoom this eve to explore, examine the roots of meaning and how words become so central to what we believe. We affirm our belief in you, dear God, awesome creator that you are, and join our thinking skills together in an exercise to explore the depths of word meaning, and especially the words from your Son, Jesus the Christ, our superstar. We do so in a world divided by politics, greed, racism, and war. With a caucus today in Iowa, crises in the Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan, with hunger, freedom issues that are cut to our human mortal core. And as we move our focus from the pain on earth to the joy you invite us to embrace, to share, to be, we recognize how fortunate we are to have this opportunity to learn, to share, to greet each other in appreciation of the Sonder, the indwelling of the divine in each person that you invite us to see. So we ask you for your blessing that patience, kindness, understanding be conferred as we are led by Brother Stubbs and his remarkable exploration of the evolution and echoes of your word. In the name of the Holy One, the voice of the heavens, Jesus Christ, your Son, we pray. Amen. Brother Stubbs, the opportunity is available for you to share your screen and share your message with us. And I invite
Thank
everyone
you.
to listen carefully.
Thank you, Paul. And well, let me see if let's see. There's that. Can you all see that?
Yes, you're before us.
Okay, we are connected then. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for the kind introduction. Like Paul said, about a year ago, or maybe I can't remember how long ago, maybe a year ago, we did the basic presentation of the data of some of the cognate sets that are that show that Uto-Aztecan is partially descended from, has pieces, or actually quite a few, a sizable chunk from Hebrew and Aramaic and Egyptian are in Uto-Aztecan. Now, it's not that they are purely descended from those, because it's apparent that they are a language mixture. I mean, that they have been influenced by other languages along the way, which is the case with many languages, if not most languages. I mean, English is 15% from Old English, and the other 85%, excuse me, is from borrowings from French and Latin and other languages. So most languages are subject to influences from other languages and language mixing. The only ones that are not are those that are quite isolated, like Icelandic out in the Atlantic Ocean. Is pretty close to the Old Norse that it is descended from. But if you put a group of Semitic speakers in the Americas, they are definitely going to be influenced by the many other groups around them. And so that's what has happened to Uto-Aztecan. However, there's a good amount, a very sizable amount that shows this tie. In fact, we're going to talk about that. Yeah, this is the title. So we presented that first edition back, and it was published in 2015. Jerry Grover was very kind in sponsoring that publication. And then just recently, I think in November, we published the second edition. I continued working on it, and well, basically, I was finding a whole bunch more stuff and revising and so forth. So we published the second edition in 2023. The first edition had 1,528 cognate sets that show to derive from Semitic and Egyptian. During that 8 years, I've realized that there were a few mistakes and a few that were weak, not very many, probably 10 or so out of 1,500. So I took those out. However, I was finding many more, found about another 150. And so now the second edition has 1,657 cognate sets to it. I'm just going to read this with you. Let's see, make sure we can see it all. For a century, the answers to many unresolved questions in Uto-Aztecan comparative linguistics eluded Uto-Aztecan specialists. Well, we'll get to it. While the language ties in this title may seem unseemly to some, they provide more explanatory power to previous unknowns in comparative Uto-Aztecan than many might be comfortable with initially. So take your time. This is straight from the introduction of the first page of the book. Edward Sapir published 2 articles in 1913 and 1915, and he established Uto-Aztecan as a language family. And the first edition of this work, 2015, was published exactly a century later. In fact, the history of publications in Uto-Aztecan, Sapir discovered the language family, or provided articles that proved that these languages are related in 1915. 1962, 3 linguists put together the first numbered list. And 1967, my old professor, Wick Miller, published Uto-Aztecan cognate sets of about 514 cognate sets in Uto-Aztecan. And then he continued adding to it. And then I published my work. He passed away, and I published my work of 2,700 cognate sets in 2011. And all of the Uto-Aztecanists, they loved it. They thought it was great. They really liked it. And then I published this book 4 years later. I'd been working on both of them simultaneously, parallel, for 30 years. When I published this one, they weren't nearly as excited, but it was the same cognate set, so they really couldn't say much about it. Same quality of work. A century later, and what's interesting is that these data, these words, solve many of the previous problems or phonological puzzles that Uto-Aztecan scholars, linguists, could not figure out. There were exceptions, but they couldn't figure out why they were exceptions. And interestingly, the Uto-Aztecan material explained the exceptions. That is very powerful explanatory evidence, shall we say. And I was hesitant, I started researching this actually in my 20s. I'm now in my 70s. So 50 years ago, I started researching this and found all kinds of interesting things. Looked at all of the language families of the Americas. There are over 190 of them. And I looked at most of them. And Uto-Aztecan is the one that I found interesting hints, good, strong, numerous strong hints that might be from Semitic. So I focused on that one. And but I didn't. I shared it with a lot of LDS linguists, and even all of them were skeptical at first until they looked at the data, until they looked at the material and the cognate sets, and then they were convinced. But anyway, it was a while before I put this to the world, and this is also from the first page. Knowing how unwelcome such a proposal would be in the linguistic hurry to invite the avalanche of controversy upon me. Yet equally risky is pressing my luck and postponing a presentation that should preferably reside on this side of the mortal divide. So as youth became by now, past tense, as youth became a memory, I shared these findings. As a Uto-Aztecanist and a Semitist is a scholar who studies Semitic language in Assyrian, Ethiopic and Ethiopia, the Southern epigraphic Arabic are different languages than our modern Arabic, and so all of those constitute the Semitic language family, and they're all in the Near East, from the northeast corner of Africa through the Fertile Crescent and so forth. Anyway, I could not help but notice numerous similarities during these three decades of compiling and writing that first work that was published in 2011, a reference work that Uto-Aztecan heartily welcomed, and Kenneth Hill favorably reviewed it in the International Journal of American Linguistics. Before we go any further, let me just be sure that y'all kind of are aware of what the Uto-Aztecan language family is. Of the 190 language families in the Americas, Uto-Aztecan is this one. I actually cut off a little bit of the map up at the top and bottom so we could get a little bit larger. But these languages are the Uto-Aztecan languages, and they're about 30, possibly 40 or 50. Some put it at 60, but it depends on how you define language versus dialect. The standard definition is that if they can understand each other, then they're simply dialects of the same language. But when they cease to understand each other, then they are different languages. And so depending on how linguists want to decide which ones can understand each other or not, there are 60 dialects, okay, and 30 or 40 languages. small dialects as languages. So, but anyway, it's a large language family, one of the largest language families in the Americas. Northern U.S. is this
Uh, Brian, you're breaking up on us, and
whole group that linguists can see spread out from the large right here. Is it okay now or is it not?
now you're clear right now.
Um, okay. Anyway, these all, maybe I'm trying to talk too fast. These all spread from the Los Angeles area. Here in southern Nevada, Utah, and western Colorado is southern Numic. This is central Numic, and so forth. There are 4 branches. Oh, okay. There are 4 branches of northern Uto-Aztecan. These are the northern Uto-Aztecan languages. These are southern Uto-Aztecan languages, and there are 7 branches of southern Uto-Aztecan. All of these are the Nahua languages or dialects. There are, while we have, these in northern Uto-Aztecan are not very many speakers left, and these are medium amounts. I mean, 20,000, I think 50,000 of Tarahumara. But of the Nahua dialects, there are 1.5 million speakers of the various 28 Nahua dialects. And this is where Uto-Aztecan is located. Let me pull it up here. Yeah, the 1,657 lexical correlations, that means cognate sets that match Hebrew or Aramaic or Egyptian, are consistent with the linguistic comparative method, that is, sound correspondences, fossilized grammar, unusual semantic combinations preserved, and so forth. And it's in the book. And they present a case far more viable than the first accepted treatise of each Native American language family. For example, Vogelin, and Hale in 1962 produced 171 Uto-Aztecan cognate sets. And that's after Sapir wrote his 2 articles. So by this time, Uto-Aztecan was well established as a language family with only 171 cognate sets. Claude produced 168 sets to establish Chumash as a language family, and that's in California. Taylor established the Caddoan language family. It's in the plains, the area where y'all are, Kansas and Arkansas, and the Caddoan. It's a small language family of about 6 or 8 languages there in the Midwest, with 107 cognate sets. Hale in 1962 and 67 produced a couple of articles identifying 99 cognate sets in Kiowa Tanoan. That's the pueblos of New Mexico. Haas united Algonquian and Rituan. That's an East Coast and West Coast language family with 93 sets. So you can see all of those are between 90 and 200 cognate sets. Well, we have 1,657. That's 8 to 10 times more than all of these. So it's a very strong case. And one of the more and this is very strong evidence of the more prevalent sets. In other words, those that are in, like I said, Uto-Aztecan has 11 branches. Now, a branch is a group of languages that are more closely related to each other than to the others. And of the 11 branches, some cognate sets are in nearly all the branches or are in all the branches. So those cognate sets that are in 8, 9, 10, or 11 of the 11 branches, 90% of those are from Hebrew, Aramaic, or Egyptian. And of the sets that are in 3 to 7 branches, 2/3 or 66% of those are of the Near East vocabulary. And by comparison, we already mentioned that in the centuries after the Norman French conquered England, only 15% of Old English vocabulary survived into modern English. The other 85% was lost and being replaced by French, Latin, and other. Whoops, that went too far. So for the more prominent Uto-Aztecan, that's 90% and 60% from the Near East data is huge and very strong evidence. In heavy contact situations, okay, now we're talking about language mixtures. When two languages live next door to each other and kind of intermix, when two peoples mix, sometimes the language will mix. Sometimes a dominant one, the language of the more dominant, will be learned by the other, but sometimes they actually mix languages, and that happens a lot in history. Many may wonder how so much of a language's basic vocabulary can be preserved in that resulting mixed language, but not much of its accompanying grammar. Yet that result is common in language mixtures. Velu Pillai gives examples. And Backer, another linguist, says that in Typology of Mixed Languages, that's an article he wrote, states that some mixed languages have close to 90% of the basic vocabulary derived from a language other than the language of the grammar. In other words, when these mix, sometimes one language will be donating most of the vocabulary, usually the culturally dominant language, and the other will contribute much of the grammar, the less dominant, because grammar is mostly subconscious and nobody has control over it. It just kind of happens. And that's could explain why Uto-Aztecan has such a high percentage of Semitic and Egyptian, even though the grammar has points of grammar that are very interesting, but not really like Semitic grammar. In fact, I think our next slide talks about that a bit. Oh, no, it doesn't. It talks about something else interesting. We also find many unusual semantic combinations, like original Near East language in Egyptian or Hebrew, and they're preserved in Uto. In Egyptian, the word Waf, or in fact, it's part of Quetzalcoatl. It's number 332 in the partner. Well, that's an unusual pair of meanings. And yet in Uto-Aztecan, it means snake and twin, that same unusual pair of meanings. Also, number 953, in fact, this is one that's found since the first edition. In Arabic, it means, whoops, I needed to plug my computer. I forgot to replug it in when I came back. Get some juice going here. It's going out. Let's see. Yeah, it means both eagle and a northern constellation in Semitic. And in Uto-Aztecan, it means vulture and a star in the north. Well, that's a very interesting pair of meanings in the ancient Semitic and also in Uto-Aztecan. And then we have another word in Egyptian that has these three meanings. It means peace or be peaceful, pacify. It also means to go down or to set, as in the sun and the stars set, to go down. It also means for the hair to fall out. Now that is a really strange combination of three very different meanings. And Uto-Aztecan, we have the same three meanings: peace, go down, and hair fall out.
Wow.
Man. Number 98 has the pair of meanings: to stamp or beat flat, metal, to be spread out, metal. Also from that same root is the word for sky. Well, Uto-Aztecan has that word matches phonologically, and it means both iron and knife. I mean, it means iron, knife, metal, and also sky. And 174 means both pasture and willow. Now, I never, willows are tall, slender things, and pasture, grass is, I never saw those two as anything alike, and yet we have the same pair of meanings in the Uto-Aztecan words that match that. So that's very interesting. Unusual semantic combinations preserved from the Near East languages to the modern. These, I just put in a few of these because they are grammatical, and we covered these last time, I think, but they're grammatical morphemes, so it's worth it to just repeat them. For example, the early Hebrew, the plural suffix in Hebrew is im. a long vowel im, but Semitists know that it came from an earlier ima, because we actually have that in some of the Semitic languages. So ima is the plural suffix in Semitic. Well, in Uto-Aztecan, the plural suffix is ima, exactly the same, except that vowel is shorter. The feminine plural suffix in Hebrew is ote. That's one of the feminine plural suffixes, I should say. In Uto-Aztecan, we have te. It lost the first vowel. Also, na is prefixed to verbs for, it's called the nif'al in Hebrew, for those that might happen to know some. It's the reciprocal and passive prefix. And the same thing in Uto-Aztecan. I think this is in 6 or 7 of the 11 branches. And the vowel change is also identical to old vowelings. Also in Egyptian, we have this e suffix that changes a verb to stative, or it's the old perfective and also the stative suffix in Egyptian, and exactly the same thing in all 11 branches of Uto-Aztecan, not just some. And then Aramaic taz, the suffix for the feminine suffix on feminine nouns, and we see the same thing in Uto-Aztecan. So that's some of the grammar points that parallel. Let's see. I also put, let me look here. I think, is this it? Yeah, just to refresh your memory, we have 1,657 parallels, but hey, here's 7 just to remind you that we have a lot. Whoops, that's not what I meant. Barach, lightning, Berok, lightning, Baka, cry. I'm not sure why this is. I actually tried to put these to the left because I knew the right side of the screen gets filled with stuff. Baka means cry in both Hebrew and Uto-Aztecan. Bat means daughter. Bata, daughter. Uto-Aztecan. Bo, coming or way to. Bo, road, way, and so forth. Going back now, let's see, where were we? Yeah, that's where we were. Anyway, this is basically we can look at some of these others and talk about it if you want, but this is basically the last slide I prepared. You can download your own copy, the PDF or digital copy of the 2nd edition of Exploring the Explanatory Power of Semitic and Egyptian in Uto-Aztecan at Jerry Grover's website, bmslr.org. That stands for Book of Mormon's Science and Language Research, is what it's an acronym for. And you can download your own copy and keep it. Like I say, that book is long and technical. I think it's about 450 or 70, 470. I can't remember how many. 470 pages, large pages, small print, of a lot of detail. A 500,000 word book that took 30 years to put together. In fact, if we count the 2nd edition, it might be closer to 40. So it's a big book, but it's basically the linguistic presentation of all the detail that has been found so far. And if you can have it, look at it, and read what parts interest you, and so forth. I think last time I had this map, I just put down a few more things that last time I think I had this map of the North America. Uto-Aztecan has a whole bunch of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Egyptian in it. And the Muskogean language family here in the Southeast United States also has some of the same words, same meanings, same sound changes, same sound correspondences. It's a smaller language family, and it doesn't have nearly as much as Uto-Aztecan, maybe about 1/3 as much, maybe. But nevertheless, enough to suggest that a group of the same group of Semitic and Egyptian speakers came around the Gulf and mixed into that language family. Now, that does not mean that these two language families are related to each other. It just means that this Southeast Muskogean language family received a sizable chunk or component of the same stuff that was in this. But And then Algonquian or Algic also has interesting stuff, but again, not only not as much as Uto-Aztecan, but not even as much as this. But nevertheless, there's enough to make one think that there was some mixture into that group. Not on this map is South America, and there are actually 5 or 6 language families in northern South America that have some of the same words, same sound changes, same things. In other words, components from this appear to have gone south and mixed with other groups down there. So that's something that's very interesting. And I think that's about all I have to say. And since I was, yeah, it's only, yeah, we're only a half hour into it. And that's what I was expecting for it to be, about a half hour, and then give you plenty of time for questions.
Wow. Yeah, I'm so impressed with this work. My archaeology tells me that when you can find the artifacts that tell you the truth, then tracing those back through their evolution can take you back to some very interesting commonalities among societies. And here you're doing the same thing with words as artifacts, and it's just phenomenal to me to see this kind of corollary and the profound connections that you're making. As I recall in your book, though, I think you highlighted the issue of race and the idea of our intermarriage, to the claim that we have for being purebred, and the idea that as we marry from one group into another, how does our marriage from one group into another correlate with our carrying language with us?
Ryan, you're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that is a good question. It goes both ways. Sometimes it carries over and sometimes it does not. For example, most of the Native Americans now speak English or Spanish. Many have lost their native language, and it is the same when languages mix. Sometimes when two peoples mix, sometimes one of the languages is lost. Other times, they'll each keep their language and just remain neighbors. Other times, the two languages will mix and become a mixture of the two. So all of the above happen in different times and places. And so because we see evidence in these language families, only means that those are where language evidence survived. But there could be lots of other groups who are part of Lehigh, but show no language evidence. Just like, for example, my wife is a native speaker of Spanish. And my children, even though they know some Spanish, they're mainly English speakers, whereas their cousins are Spanish speakers. And that happens a lot in life and in the world. And most peoples are mixtures. Once I've sat down and figured, in fact, there's an article in Morsels for the Mind on the minorities and the mixed. It's entitled "The Minorities and the Mixed, and No One is Left," right? Meaning that everybody is mixtures. My children have about 20 different ethnic groups that they are descended from, and it would be much the same for everybody, or for most peoples. For example, people look for Israel, pure Israelites. There's no such thing. The 12 sons of Jacob did not marry sisters, probably, and so each of his grandchildren were 1/4 of Israel, and it only got thinner from there. So yeah, all of us are mixtures, and same thing with the language. Some languages will keep the old stuff better, and others will lose it. So yeah, good question, and all of the above are what happens in different times, different places.
Let me encourage people to go to the reactions and raise your hand. We commonly have Deb trying to keep track of all the questions in the queue. And so if you'll go there and put your questions out, then we'll try to keep it in order. And I'm so pleased to have this kind of in-depth perception of our linguistic background.
Okay, we
Other-
have one question in the chat asking how many of the viewers actually know what a cognate is. Is there a small brief definition on that?
Yeah, let's review that. A cognate set is a group of related words in the descendant languages that are descended from the original ancient word. So for example, in English, we have hound, and in German is Hund, and those are cognates of something else that came earlier. We also have water in English, watar in ancient I forgot that. And we have hudor in Greek, and all of those are descended from the same ancient Indo-European word. And so that group of words that are descended from the same ancient word are cognates. And so a cognate set is a group of words that descend from one ancient word. So when we say, we have 1,657 cognate sets descended from Egyptian or Hebrew, that means that these are groups of words that descended from an ancient word. So we have 1,657 ancient words have their cognates in these descendant languages. Did that help?
I believe it probably did for some. I don't know that it had ever helped me, but thank you for that. Val, you can go ahead. It's your turn.
Okay, so in English, we can probably say a little about the history of the people based on the nature of the language. So now we have the history, so it makes it easier, obviously. But like the base language, the base grammar is Germanic, and the common people sort of held on to that apparently. You overlay on top of that the French from the Norman invasion, and then the prestige of the Roman Empire. So we have this huge Latin and French on an English base. And that kind of reflects the history of the original Germanic people being invaded by the Normans, who had prestige, but they still weren't the mass of people. So that the old grammar was held on to. So what I'm wondering is it possible, based on the pattern of influences, where the grammar is something else than Hebrew, but a lot of the vocabulary overlaid on top of that grammar was Hebrew or Egyptian, to say anything about a possible underlying history of this influence? Like, why is the grammar something other than Hebrew? What does that tell us about the relationships between some base population and some interloper or a cultural influence or whatever? Can we make anything of that?
Yes, very good question. And you're exactly right. The advantage we have in English is that it's a written language since about 500 AD or so, and so it gives us a lot of hints of how it happened. We have written records to show how it happened. The disadvantage in Native American languages is that we don't have those written records anciently. All of these became written languages as linguists discovered them and wrote them down in the Latin alphabet. But nevertheless, linguists, through various means, can figure out some of that. But like you say, not as thoroughly or as clearly, or shall we say, as rapidly. It much of it is probably available and discernible if enough linguists spend enough time on it. The problem is that for English, for example, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of linguists working on it and all the written records. For Uto-Aztecan, I'm the only one dealing with the Near East tie. There are one or two, three other linguists who are dealing with the language family, but ignoring the Near East tie. But even it's hard to, in other words, there's so few of us working on it that progress is real slow. But you're exactly right. It's all possible. I should say it. Some of it's possible, but it's slow going when so few are working on it.
Do you have any conjectures at all, given the pattern of a underlying grammar that was not Semitic, and an overlying Semitic vocabulary. Any conjectures at all of what would lead to that kind of pattern in the language?
Yeah, what we have is some of the grammar aspects of Uto-Aztecan are fairly typical of Native American languages generally. For example, many Native American languages have a plural singular distinction of verb uses. You'd have a whole separate verb for when one person does it, and a different verb for when plural multiple people do something. And we have about 20 verb pairs like that in Uto-Aztecan, and that's fairly typical of Native American languages, but it is not in Semitic or Egyptian at all. So that is one aspect that was borrowed into Uto-Aztecan sometime in the past. And we have things like that. We have a lot of things that are typical of Native American languages in Uto-Aztecan, and then other things that are the Semitic and Egyptian in Uto-Aztecan. So it's definitely a mix, but trying to determine the degree of the mix or how it happened and when it happened, all of those details are what is very challenging. But yes, you're right. There's pieces.
If I were making a guess on it, it would be something like this, that there was already a population there when the Semitic people arrived.
Right.
That's the mass of the people. But this incoming population has a really, really strong cultural influence.
Right.
And that therefore a lot of their vocabulary is taken over, but it isn't enough to displace the original grammatical base. But it's a suggestion of immense cultural power, but a smaller population. And that's actually what you might expect from Lehi and his family arriving in the New World, where there's already existing populations that are much larger than they are, but that his family has a lot of cultural influence because of the perspectives and just information that they would have, or whatever. That at least seems to me like one plausible reading of this pattern.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. That was my assumption as well. We do find a surprising number of grammatical things that are from Hebrew and Egyptian. In fact, we showed you some of those on that one. Let's see, where is it? But anyway, but you're right, and very much is not. And so your supposition is exactly what I think as well. Trying to figure out the details of exactly what and how it all happened, though, is tricky. But yeah, you're right.
Okay, thanks, Val. Terry, you're next, and then Frank. Go ahead, Terry.
I think everybody can see the elephant in the room, but nobody wants to ask. Is there a way to date these incursions of Semitic languages into the native Uto-Aztecan languages?
Good question. The glottochronology was a method put together to try to date languages, and it kind of worked some of the time. However, linguists have found that it really doesn't work very well much of the time. And so, for example, Yiddish, for example, is also descended from Semitic. The Yiddish speakers being the Jews that were originally in the north side of the Mediterranean and migrated north into Europe. Yiddish contains about 15% Hebrew and Aramaic. And according to glottochronology, that separation from the Palestinian homeland would mean that they separated about 10,000 years ago. Of course, we know that they only separated probably 2,000 to 2,500 years ago or so, maybe 3,000, depending on when the Jews that were in Rome and everywhere left Palestine. But in other words, glottochronology does not work in that case at all. And it's similar to Uto-Aztecan, I think. Uto-Aztecan, many people suggest that these all separated about 5,000 years ago. The problem is that, in fact, probably a minority of linguists give glottochronology much credence. And it could be that because they are mixtures, it could be half that, which would be, about 2,500 years ago. And that's, that's my guess for this one component anyway. So yeah, that's a good question. And they're trying to do glottochronology, but glottochronology has lost respect among linguists to a great degree. And so they try to date, carbon date archaeological sites that they think are this people or that people. And if they are right in deciding who that was that lived there, then that could be helpful. But there's among most sites, there's questions as to who was really there, or whether that was a Uto-Aztecan people or another people. So there are still a lot more questions in the air than answers. But a good point.
In the end, archaeology is death. So, it's understandable.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Frank, go ahead, and then Paul.
Yes, thank you, Brian, for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. I'm wondering how many, I can barely see your chart there that you've got up right now. Do you have anything that goes farther south into the Maya area? So you have I think one name that says Maya on it, Maya. Is that correct?
That's a Mayo. Yeah, the
Mayo.
first kind of
Okay.
small. Mayo is a Uto-Aztecan language versus Maya
Okay.
is the Mayan language family. And you're right. The Mayan language family would be, this only shows a corner of it. And
Right.
it is, it's in southern Mexico and Guatemala. And it stretches a little bit further south. But you're
How many
right.
cognates have you found in that? Any?
None. Yeah, Mayan doesn't really show much. In fact, what's interesting is that the Olmec and a lot of LDS archaeologists consider the Olmec to be the Jaredites, and the Mixe-Zoquean language family, which is a small language family right here on the isthmus, uh, probably, I don't know, 8 languages or so, a small language family right here, still alive today. It's been shown, or I should say, linguists have decided that that is descended from the Olmec, which is very interesting. Also, you have a large Otomanguean language family that covers most of Mexico. In fact, they intertwine with these Uto-Aztecan languages a lot. And then you have the Mayan language family. A few linguists think that those three are distantly related, or that they are partially descended from the Olmec. And I think they're probably right, but again, they might be mixtures of several things. And so yeah, we've got some Olmec descendant languages in this area too, which are very different from Uto-Aztecan. And the Mayan is probably distant related, or might be a break off from Olmec type stuff, maybe.
Do you have any information about the tonal aspects of Zapotec? And we spent a lot of time in Oaxaca, and we learned that the Zapotec and I believe the Mixtec, which are right adjacent to each other there, are tonal languages, which has different kind of relationship. Is that related with any of these groups, or is it totally different?
Yeah, the Zapotec and the Mixtec, you're right, down there in Oaxaca and southern Mexico, they are Otomanguean languages. They belong to the Otomanguean language family, and many of those Otomanguean languages have tonal systems like Chinese, and I mean, their
Right.
tonal systems aren't the same as, but as
I
these
was going to mention
Southeast
that,
Asian
yeah.
languages have tonal systems, so do many Mixe-Zoquean languages, or I mean, Otomanguean languages have tonal systems. And tonal systems can be a quality descended from the parent language, or it can be something that has developed since. I think last time maybe I did the trick of in English, where I tell my classes, I'm going to give you a phrase in English. Do you remember this? And I tell them, ask them, what am I saying? And I say, mechanical ability. And they can't understand it, but I'm saying mechanical ability, but with a different stress or tone system. Instead of stressing the second of each of 4 syllables, mechanical ability,
Syllables,
I
yeah,
stress
right.
the first and third, mechanical
Wow.
ability, and nobody understands it, native speakers of English. And yet another time, I think I gave the example of in the neighborhood I grew up in Los Angeles, we kids got in the lazy habit of saying this one sentence this way. We would say, oh, and
Yeah.
oh,
I don't know.
has no consonants or vowels, no sounds, only the tone, but
Yep.
everyone knows exactly what we said. I don't know. And so,
Yep.
so in a way, English is all language, most languages have tonal aspects, and so you can see
Okay.
how a tonal system might develop. But yeah, very good point. The Otomanguean languages have a lot of tonal systems, and that might be an aspect of that old Olmec ancestor. Could be. I don't know. And then and nobody knows.
One more question. I finally heard a lecture about this about 40 years ago on the radio. It's about the Hebrew source of English. It was done by Isaac Moseson. Have you ever heard of him?
No.
He wrote a book that's called The Word, the dictionary that reveals the Hebrew source of English. And I finally got a copy of it just recently, and I've been looking into that. It if you go online, try to find it, it's over $100 in most places, but I finally found one that was over half that, but I still went ahead and bought it anyway because I've been looking for it so long. But I think he lives in Israel, but he's got a lot of things that I'd say, you know, if you're interested in it, I'd send you a copy of his recorded lecture. I don't know whether it'll do you any good with your research or not, but it's got the Hebrew things that connect the English language with Hebrew.
Well, yeah, I've read. What was his name again?
Isaac Moses' son.
Isaac Moseson. I've read something else by another Jewish linguist who's talks about Indo-European, the language family that English descends from, as having a Germanic having a Hebrew component. And for example, earth and arda, eretz in Hebrew, but arda in earlier Semitic. Arda is close to earth. So there are a few things like that, but
Oh, he points out horse and hearse, you know, are related together, and they come directly from the Hebrew. There, I could give you
yeah,
a bunch
Hebrew
of
is Zeus.
examples, but that's not our
Hebrew word
topic.
for
So,
horse is Zeus. Yeah, that hasn't gained much credibility among linguists. Um, I think there is an Israelite component in Germanic, but I think it's not obvious, not large, and yeah, I haven't looked at his stuff, but most people that come up with that, it hasn't gained a lot of traction among linguists. But hey,
yeah, I
you
know
know,
it's.
he might have something.
I know it doesn't give a lot of traction there because there's a certain mindset among academics that if you're not in the in crowd, you don't go anywhere.
Right, you're right on that.
So,
Yeah, that's where I am. I'm on the outside of the. I was on the in crowd until I published this book. But hey,
yeah,
that's okay.
you bet.
You got to
Well,
publish
I
truth, and
appreciate you.
that's why in the introduction I said, yeah, you know, just take your time, keep looking
Good
at
for
it and
you.
thinking about it.
Yeah,
It'll sink in eventually.
hang
It'll
in
get
there.
it'll get recognized eventually with time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Paul, go ahead and then Val.
Bill has his hand up. I'd yield to him.
Oh, I can't see Bill, sorry.
But
Well, anyway, my question, I mean, I speak Mandarin Chinese, which is a tonal language. And I wonder, what is your explanation for some of those languages down there being tonal?
You mean the Otomanguean languages that are tonal in Mexico?
Yes,
Yeah,
where do they
uh,
come from?
good question. Good question. If it's very possible that the Noah's language, the Adamic language, was tonal, and that maybe Chinese preserved that to a degree. Maybe these others, maybe Jaredite did to a degree. I don't really know, but yeah, they're um,
Huh.
that's a good question. It's
You
far
know,
enough back that nobody's figured it out.
okay, I'd like to address the matter. I had a professor, Charles Mann, who was an anthropology professor, ethnographer, who had studied in southern Mexico, and one of the accounts he gave us was having watched from the mountainside while a gentleman whistled an exchange with another gentleman who was uh, riding a burro carrying pots, and the two men whistled back and forth as he traveled down the mountain slope and exchanged pots with nothing but the whistle language having been consummated. And
Wow.
so that tonal language may have very deep roots, I think. And your suggestion that it may be a very fundamental and basic means of understanding, almost an intuitive kind of understanding, it intrigues me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't heard about the whistling language. That's yeah, it could be created. In fact, one area of language is people who actually make up languages. In fact, I made up a language in my young days, trying to make a very efficient language that would be shorter than the others. And then there's the Esperanto, that is a kind of a made up language of the European bases. And so there are made up languages, and that whistle language sounds interesting. I hadn't heard of that one, but I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah, whistles.
Well,
Yeah, a
my
lot of different
earlier,
tones.
I raised my hand to ask about the Jaredites, but then you addressed the matter of the Olmec linguistic family, and so I'll accept that. I would appreciate it if you would clarify and note in one of your books, you speak of the difference between the syncretic and the diachronic um, use of linguistics, and I would appreciate if you clarify that for us. My understanding is that syncretic, if I got that right, synchronic, I think you called it,
You're-
you had a single hearing versus multiple hearings, so you pick up more of the history on it.
Yes, you're correct. A synchronic look at a language is how it looks at any given time. It's one time. In fact, syn means one, and chron means time. Diachronic is two times, so you're comparing how it has changed over times. Uh, and so, yeah, comparative linguistics dealing with historical linguistics is necessarily diachronic, and a synchronic view of a language is what its vocabulary and grammar is at any given time. A diachronic view is how that grammar has changed and how the vocabulary has changed over time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Val, go ahead, please.
Hey, you might already have spoken to this, saying that this branch of linguistics is discredited, but I'm not sure I understood what branch you were talking about. But my question is for the Book of Mormon geography people, which doesn't include me in particular, or it's not my main interest, but nonetheless, it's a major area of interest. Indo-European, I think linguists feel like they can trace that back to its original heartland where it got started. And and you can kind of tell what the peripheries are to some extent. The geography based on I'm guessing that it has to do with where they keep more of the original roots or something. I'm not sure exactly what the logic of it is and even how sound it might be. But I'm wondering if there's any way to identify the likely homeland of Uto-Aztecan. When you see this distribution of different variants, is there any way to say it probably got started here and that these are more peripheral and this is more central, anything like that?
Hey, very good question. Yes, and I can tell you what I think. To answer your first questions, yeah, glottochronology is that method in linguistics of measuring language change over time, and that's kind of what's been, I wouldn't really say discredited. Linguists look at it and kind of put it as one of the factors and kind of with a grain of salt, and so it hasn't been thrown out, but it's not heavily depended upon. As far as Book of Mormon geography, yeah, I'll tell you what I think. The Heartland people that, let's see, can you see my little thing moving on the screen?
Yes.
I'm putting a circle there in the Heartland, actually where some of you folks live. They believe that the Book of Mormon area was right there, and because they find a lot of interesting stuff up there. Most BYU archaeologists have it right here. This is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec right there, and they think that is the narrow neck of land. And there's two rivers here. There's the Grijalva and the Usumacinta. I think Grijalva has gotten more attention lately as the possible site. And then you have a lot of people who think it's in South America. And what I think is that they are all right to a degree, and that they just really need to start working together instead of fighting each other. I mean, you have the Mesoamericanists and the Heartland people arguing that the other one's wrong and should go jump in a lake. But actually, I see that homeland as, I think the Mesoamericanists are right. I'm not an archaeologist, but I simply looked at all the languages of the Americas, and we have these three groups in North America, and Quechua, and 4 or 5 others in northern South America, in Colombia and along the Andes, that have very interesting stuff, the same kind of stuff. For example, in Quechua, the word for heart is sunca, and the word for heart in Uto-Aztecan is sun, and the word in Egyptian for feelings is sun. And so there's quite a bit of interesting stuff in Quechua and other language groups in northern South America. So it seems to me that it did start in Mesoamerica and Middle America somewhere, that those folks went south. A number of people went south and mixed with people, and those are those language families that have that Semitic Egyptian component. Uto-Aztecan, I think, is mostly, you know that in the Book of Mormon, in Hagoth's time, he started a shipping industry, and they launched into the West Sea and sailed to the land northward. Well, it just so happens that of Uto-Aztecan's 11 branches, 10 of the 11 are on the west coast of Mexico or started from the Los Angeles area. All of them are West Coast language branches. Only Nahua or Aztec is spread all over southern Mexico and down into parts of Guatemala and further south. The other 10 are this. So my opinion is that it was right here, and that most of Uto-Aztecan, these 10 of 11 branches, are those descended from those who launched into the West Sea and sailed to the land northward, and that Muskogean received a group of Lehite, Nephite travelers that went around the Gulf of Mexico. They hit the Missouri River, go north, and they have to have fresh water, so they branch out into the river systems and that's how Muskogean probably got that infusion or that part of that their mixture, and also into the Algonquian language family, and then of course those peoples would have mixed with the Siouan and other language families in the area, even though the language didn't survive. Lots of mixing with people where they don't keep their original language, and then other groups that went into South America. So there's a lot of Lehigh blood in South America, especially in the Andes and in northern South America, and a lot in Uto-Aztecan and a lot in the Midwest. And all of them are places where Lehigh posterity went to and mixed with the people. And a few spots have interesting language evidence, residual evidence, and others don't have much. So that's my opinion, is that all of them are looking at stuff that's worth looking at, and just need to start working together instead of fighting each other.
The given where the Uto-Aztecan is, and given that the base grammar is maybe indigenous and the vocabulary is borrowed, that your point about Haggath, or in the Book of Mormon, the pressures on the Nephites tend to come from the south, which would force a lot of them north, if they were fleeing that pressure. And so I think you might end up then having an influence that they came up there to people who were already there and then had cultural influences on them. Yeah, so I think that would seem to fit with the pattern you've got. But anyway, thanks for the comment.
Yeah. They all these people that went up here, definitely, you're right. They've mixed with other peoples. In fact, the DNA situation has the male DNA of Uto-Aztecan peoples is more consistent, whereas the mitochondrial female dimensions are like they married into different peoples. The Nunuk here, for example, have different mitochondrial than some of these others, even though the male. So it looks like the men did most of the spreading and then married into local populations after they got there to a degree. In fact, there's interesting DNA evidence. I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but there's interesting DNA evidence in Uto-Aztecan of, let's see, what do they call it? Lymphocyte antigens. I can't remember the technical word. I'm not a microbiologist either, but there are some interesting DNA parallels between the Uto-Aztecan peoples and the Arabs. Now, the Arabs are the same gene pool as the Israelites. And so that's interesting that there are some the highest numbers for certain DNA markers. The highest numbers are in the Arab populations and the Uto-Aztecan populations, and those numbers are zero in some other Native Americans and in China and other places. So that's really interesting evidence for a Near East connection that would not be from across the Bering Strait.
I had seen Earl Watt had his hand up and he's put a question in the chat. Is Earl still with us? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, Frank, go ahead.
Yes. Again, I don't know how your research is done. Is it done with purely with sounds, or is it with any kind of written language?
Hey, good question. It is. Yeah, it is. It's only done with modern language, but yeah, written down. So in other words, what happens is linguists, as they meet these Native American groups, none of them had written languages that they could read. There's the
Right.
ancient Mayan glyphs that they could no longer read, but they have found what Mayan group it is most closely related to. But
Well,
what happens is a linguist will, for example, the Ute language. In fact, this is a dictionary that I wrote, and what linguists do is they record the language using the Latin alphabet,
right.
what it sounds like, and then those dictionaries. So we work from those dictionaries and find cognate sets, and linguists can figure out from the sounds of this array of related words, what the original word looked like, or what its sounds were like.
Yeah,
And,
that's what the Wycliffe people do. There was a group of Wycliffe translators down in Mitla, Oaxaca, and we talked with them quite a bit. The reason I was asking is because in Barry Fell's book, America BC, he's got 2 chapters in there that talk about the presence of Egyptian influence, and that's connected. I see on your map here, I see Micmac in there, and he points out that the Micmac is very, very closely tied with the Egyptian written language. Are you aware of Barry Fell's work?
Yes, and I've looked at that article that relates Micmac with the Egyptian, and there are some interesting things. Yeah, Micmac right up here. Interesting things. The Egyptologists that look at it, really can't see it, so it's changed enough. I mean, if it is tied to Egyptian anyway, it's changed enough that again, the scholars don't give it a lot of credence, but that doesn't mean that that there might not be something there. So I've looked at that, and it's interesting enough to keep in mind. It would be nice if we had some intermediate steps to show it more solidly, but yeah, Barry Fell, I've read some of his works. I think he's got some good points here and there, but sometimes he goes a little further than the evidence really should suggest. But hey, he did his work in his time, and I think some of it will show merit someday.
Thank you.
Lynn or Philip, whichever.
Yeah, I was looking at California there. We're from California. My tribe is the Noromok Wintu nation. Wintu means people. And at one time we reached all the way to San Francisco. And now if you look on some of the maps, basically you'll see the Algonquin travels with the Yurok right there on the coast, not on the other side of Mount Shasta, if you want to say, and it goes out, but then they speak the Algonquin language.
Dialect, yeah.
Dialect, and but we speak the Pitwin, and but that language. But I noticed on the maps, I've sat on the council for 20 years, and still I am kind of working with the tribe. But anyway, there's a square that basically runs California all the way down that ridge down there, the Sierra Mountains, and all the way to San Francisco. And but anyway, that's the only place you'll find the Pitwin. And so they were kind of set off by themselves. The rest were all the way, the Algonquin reached all the way in
Around you.
almost up to the Great Lakes. And but it was kind of interesting, the territory, and they ran that whole northern ridge up there. But anyway, it's quite interesting. The guy that did a lot of they came in, took our they took graves, opened them up, whatever, and hauled off bones to the Smithsonian Institute and all that. Even Ishi was part of that. The last Indian in the California, they say it was, but that wasn't a true story, that he was the last one, because I know the people that and we did get, finally our tribe finally got Ishi's brain back from the Smithsonian, and but anyway, they finally delivered that. We buried it at a very unique spot there on Haynes Creek. But anyway, kind of interesting. But I know this map doesn't show those extra little spots where all these different tribes lived, and my people don't believe that they came across. They were born there. And that's just the way they did. We got skulls that are, my goodness, over 10,000 years old, and in California. But anyway, so I just was wondering why, and the guy that would come in and did a lot of that his name was Dubois. And I guess he kind of, I don't know, French or whatever, but he came in and documented a lot of the linguistics, had people come in and learn. So there's quite a bit of book work on that. And but just wanted to let you understand that tribes had territories, in our names, although we call them Putwin, but
The language.
they were named. Norelmuk was our name, which would mean south downriver, up above, like a turtle shell shape. So the territory, the land, become part of their names, and so they were broken up all over in different land. We got in palms, meaning territory, land, and whatnot. So, but it's kind of interesting how that describes each different group that was in the valley floor. At one time, we reached all the way to San Francisco.
Yes, you're right. There are many language families in California. Yeah, we're just showing Uto-Aztecan, but you're right. In fact, there are more language families in California than there are in Europe. I just recently read, and yes, I had the map on that other presentation of the North American language families, and you'll see lots of little dots in California. Yeah, so the Wintu, are they Penutian? They might belong to what?
That's what they say in research things.
The
but
Penutian is a large group of languages that even those haven't been decided for sure that they are related, but they think they might be. But yeah, Ishi is interesting. I've read up on Ishi. In fact, he was Yana, I think was the
Yes,
tribe he was from was Yana.
they're
And
neighboring.
Ishi means
Ishi
means man, from what I
yeah,
read, that Ishi means man, and that's
Right.
interesting because the Hebrew word for man is Ish, and I've looked at those language families. I looked at Yana, and I looked at Wintu a little bit, I remember, and I've looked at a lot of Penutian languages, and they have interesting stuff. So they are one of those that have, in my opinion, have Lehite infusions mixed with whatever else. And whoops, what happened there? Anyway,
Well, Ishi
yeah,
was too. He was from out of Mount Lassen area, and he was Achagewi, and Achagewi, and that was Lassen area territory, and Yana, and so. But anyway, so basically they bridged in between on Paynes Creek there, and
yeah.
but anyway,
Neighboring
I got to get involved with. I know the family. I know the family.
Yeah.
And
The-
so,
The Native Americans, I should say the 49ers treatment of the Native Americans was extremely tragic. Of course, there's tragedies all over, but yeah, it's extremely unfortunate. A lot of interesting stuff in those California language families that dwindled quite quickly, partly because of genocide and partly because of a cultural assimilation so quickly with
Disease.
the high English populations being absorbed and forgetting their language and so forth. I mean, all of these, let me go back to my Uto-Aztecan map. All of these Los Angeles area languages of Uto-Aztecan, likewise, not very many speakers left, even though there's a small tribal group that still considers themselves a tribe, but they've kind of forgotten their language, except as it's written in dictionaries and so forth that linguists produced 50 years ago or whatever.
the one thing though is like the Klamath Indian.
Yes, the Klamath
They
Penutian.
they were just above on the other side of Mount Shasta, and they got relocated by the government all the way back east. And so, they took a lot of the tribes, but the ones that remained, Captain Jack, they call him Captain Jack because they knew the lava tubes and whatnot. They go down in them, and so the cavalry, when they go in them, they get bit by rattlesnakes, and so they lost the war. So they just took whatever was on on the surface and went and left and took a tribe. That's why you got the Modocs, they call them Modocs. The Modoc Indians, there's a Modoc in your area, but they came from there, from California.
In Oregon, yeah.
Yes. Yes, the Ochagewi, I remember that. Yeah, interesting. Like I say, you've got Lehite ancestry with all of the Wintu and whatever else.
Okay, James
Any other
Lucas.
questions?
James Lucas has his hand up. Go ahead, James.
There we go. I apologize. I came into the presentation late, so apologies if I am repeating things that you had already explained. But I'm looking at your map that you have up right now, and so you're showing 3 language groups. Do those represent language groups where you have found Hebraic influences? Is this your map, or is this a secular map that shows 3 language families that are the generally recognized amongst your very small group of linguists who study it, who are seen as having similarities and being of some kind of common family, perhaps?
Yeah, this is my map. This is my map, and those in red are Uto-Aztecan, and that's where the strongest Semitic and Egyptian evidence is. This is Muskogean, which has an infusion of that in it, but they're not, the 2 language families are not related, but this one has an infusion from what was in Uto-Aztecan. Algic also has some interesting stuff, but much less. And so I probably shouldn't even show this map because I should have put that other map on. I have another map of North America that shows, the 50 or 60 language families of North America. There are a lot of language families. I just talked about these 3 a little bit, but we're mainly focused on simply Uto-Aztecan. That's the language family that I know best, and I haven't published anything in these others, but I've looked at them a lot, and yeah, this is the map I should have up there. Uto-Aztecan.
Okay, but going back to the other map, you are saying, though, that based on your own research, that the other 2, the 2 there in Eastern North America, the Algic and the Muskogean, your view is that they have more Hebraic influence than any of the other language families in North America, other than that Western Uto-Aztecan group. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is for Muskogean especially. What Uto-Aztecan has, and Muskogean has maybe 1/3 as much as Uto-Aztecan, and Algic maybe has 1/3 as much as Muskogean, so like 1/10 as much as Uto-Aztecan. So in Algic, it's not strong enough at all, but there's a few interesting items that make me think it has an infusion of some sort from that, but it would be it's small enough that it would be hard to prove and convince anybody. But Uto-Aztecan is large enough and solid enough that it's a good strong case. These others are not strong cases, and so I'm not even recommending that a linguist try to prove it, just because the evidence is small enough that linguists will just chalk it up to coincidence and not it's just not as strong and solid as Uto-Aztecan is.
Okay, and on the Uto-Aztecan, you know, I'm not trying to be difficult here, but I mean, is it fair to say that your very few handful of other people who study Uto-Aztecan, have they looked at your work? Are they persuaded in the least by it, or have you not even really exchanged with the handful of other Uto-Aztecan secular linguists on this subject?
Oh yeah, most of them. I sent a preliminary edition to about 30, the top 30 Uto-Aztecanists, and 5 or 6 of them, emailed back that it was a very good, strong case. The other 25 remained silent, didn't want to say anything. But I'm good friends with most of the Uto-Aztecanists. I've been going to the Uto-Aztecan conferences every summer. There's a Uto-Aztecan conference where people present papers and on their latest findings and research, and I've been going to those since the 80s. And so I know them all, or I know most of them, and I'm friends with a good number of them, and they've all respected my work highly. And then when this Semitic Egyptian thing, when I presented it to them, hey, a lot of them clammed up, but there were 5 or 6 that said, hey, you've got a strong case there. I don't particularly like it, and, and you've got an uphill battle trying to convince people, but they couldn't say anything against it. And I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation that only 2 linguists have tried to take it down, and my response to them is in an article that's online entitled Answering the Critics in 44 Rebuttal Points. Also in that article is what other linguists have said. In fact, boy, is there a way to pull up stuff online? I'm sure there is, but I'm not techie enough to know how to do that. But anyway, just look up that article, Answering the Critics in 44 Rebuttal Points. And in that article, there are footnotes and a section of that article where it talks about what the authorities are saying about it. In fact, I could read you what. Let me minimize this, and I can read you what some of them have said. Let me. Well, I hadn't better. I'll just mess it up if I try to do that.
Brian, let me.
One last question. Of the Uto-Aztecan, you kind of show on the map kind of 3 groups, sort of one down in mid-Mexico, one on the west coast of Mexico, and then one on the west coast of what is now the United States. You had indicated that using just language to do a chronology is kind of dicey, a difficult thing. Is there any other kind of evidence, or I mean, amongst the scholars who would who study this sort of thing, to suggest that the diffusion was south to north?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there it used to be think that it was all north to south, but there are 3 of us who think it's south to north, and for 3 different reasons. There's some. Jane Hill kind of produced some agricultural evidence. It has been questioned, but there's other anthropologists who have agreed with her that there is genetic evidence also of some traveling from south to north of Uto-Aztecan peoples. Another linguist sees that the southern Uto-Aztecan branches seem more diverse than the northern, and usually diversity means in place longer, and he thinks that the homeland is in the south. I look at the phonology and see the phonological variety in the South is much greater than that in the North. And that's also in the book. It's anyway, it's in the book. In fact, in the book, download that book on bmslr.org. The last, I've lost my thing trying to do something that I didn't know how to do.
Oh, yeah.
But
That's
that book
okay.
on bmsl.org, download it. And toward the end is a page about the author, and also about in that are a number of opinions of other linguists and non-LDS linguists too. David Kelly, who was a famous linguist, and hey, maybe this will work. Oh, hey, there we are. Yes, David Kelly, who was a famous linguist and also helped in the decipherment of the Mayan glyphs. He was sent a preliminary edition of my work, and I didn't even send it to him. Another BYU scholar, archaeologist, sent it to him, and he said when he first got it in the mail, he looked at the thick thing and he didn't want to open it, but he dutifully opened it, intending to look at a page or two, but he opened it, started reading, and found it interesting enough. He ended up reading the whole thing. He said it's the most interesting and significant research he had seen in years. He has since passed away, but he was one of the top anthropologists of the time. And anyway, a few top linguists have said those kinds of things. And like I say, but most of them are silent. So it's getting some good traction among scholars, even though it's in the beginning stages.
What was the reason why the majority of secular non-LDS Uto-Aztecan scholars thought that the diffusion was north to south rather than from the north to the south rather than the opposite?
Oh, just because they think everything came across the Bering Strait. So they assumed it had to be from north to south.
Oh, okay.
Brian, if you would please, you began with 1,500 cognates, went to 1,650, and I think those are the cognates for the Uto-Aztecan on your map on the west. But then I think you said a third, so we're talking about roughly 500 cognates for the Muskogean, and a third of those, maybe 200 of up in the Algic area.
Well, yeah, for Muskogean, make it more like 300 or 300 maybe. So yeah, maybe a third as much. Maybe it's more like a fifth as much. And for the Algic, the pronouns are interesting in Algic, and a few other terms. So it'd be maybe only 50. So a very small number, but interesting ones. And so I wouldn't even spread the word that Stubbs thinks
Okay.
Algonquian is has Semitic and Egyptian in it, because it's a small enough amount that it couldn't be really made a good case of it. So I'm just kind of sharing what I see is what seems probable in my mind, even though it's small enough amount not to make a good case of.
Okay, let me take you another direction for a little bit, because in one of your books, I remember your reference to the English use of with, as in withstanding. What was it? But the idea of English use of with has changed significantly.
Well, yeah, there's that. Withstand. It used to mean against, or that was one of its meanings. That's the thing about languages. Every word has lots of meanings, and when meanings change, it means some of its meanings get left off while it acquires others. For example, girl, I think, used to be neutral, gender neutral, kind of like guy. And now guy, even though it originally meant male, it has kind of become neutral. I mean, I have 4 daughters, and sometimes I'll say, "Hey, you guys want to go get an ice cream?" And there's not a guy among them, but that's how English changes. So y'all languages are changing all the time, and every word has a package of meanings, and some of those meanings gradually get left off, and then it'll sometimes acquire another meaning or two or three.
I think you drew a beautiful parallel with our use of color, and perhaps you elucidate that a bit.
Yeah, how colors divide among themselves in languages is interesting because, for example, in Native American languages, green and blue are often the same word. In a whole bunch of, I mean, across, it's kind of a cultural thing that spread over much of the Americas, whereas, in English, we don't really mix green and blue so much, and they'll have to do, like sky green, call it for real blue. And of course, white just means light colored. It can mean grayish, light gray, and they don't have orange, but they'll have red and white. And anyway, each language kind of tends to have its own color system, and when languages neighbor each other or are of the same language family, sometimes they'll have more similar systems, but those systems can also change over time.
Mm-hmm. Well, one more question, and then I'll be happy to yield. But because I'm a chess coach, and I remember encountering in your book, you use the opportunity to highlight chess skills and thinking skills. And I'm curious, because you're clearly giving emphasis to our need to develop thinking skills. How do linguistic studies help us with that?
Well, every science has its kind of, let's say, standard ways of looking at or thinking about things. Linguists do, but should more use statistics and probabilities. I mean, in fact, originally comparative linguistics started with they could see that Latin and Greek and Sanskrit and Germanic and a few language families were related because there were similar words and similar grammatical patterns in them, such that it seemed highly improbable that those could happen by chance. And so the probabilities, which is a mathematical, statistical approach to things, almost guaranteed that they came from a common origin. And that's basically the foundation of historical linguistics, is when you have a number of similarities that fit a system of sound correspondences and the other things that linguists have found to be of value in identifying related languages, and that removes almost all doubt, and would be mathematically impossible that be by coincidence. For example, we showed you some of these these. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Yeah. What's the probability that a word for serpent and partner in Egyptian would also retain not only the phonological parallel, but the meanings of snake and twin? I mean, the probability of that happening by chance is near zero. And then you take eagle and northern constellation carrying over to vulture and the star in the north, the probability of that being carried over by chance is close to zero. And same with all of these. And you add up all of those together, 1,600 of them, and do the math, and it's just very solid and so close to improbable that it's impossible that it could be by chance. And so therefore it must be good solid evidence that there was an actual carryover and that they are that this tie is valid. And so, yeah, statistical probability is important in linguistics and in a lot of other things that people forget about and should be used a lot more in a lot of sciences. But you know, for example, well, never mind. I'm not going to say that. But
I think I understand.
anyway, yeah, statistical probability is important in linguistics, I think. And I used to be a math major, so that's why I kind of like to dabble in it. But
well, I'm particularly intrigued by your piece, Go Down and Hair Fall Out, because for us old men to be able to live long enough, hopefully that means we at least escape the wars and have a chance to live in peace to some extent to our old age. And
yes,
we do go down and our hair falls out. And so that one intrigues me as being a closer representation to the life cycle than I initially thought.
yeah, we're a lot of us are in that boat.
I would yield to any other questions or points to be raised. But let me thank you again, Brian Stubbs, for what I think is a marvelous study, a lifetime study, a study that I hope you never get to a final draft, because if I recall reading your book correctly, then all of your drafts are to be continued to be worked on until you die. And even then, I'd like to hope that your drafts can continue to be worked on so that your work lives on well beyond you.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I said in the book, is that only when I die do all drafts become final drafts. So yeah, we'll just keep working on things for as long as I have years to continue doing.
I want you to come
went through
back every year.
I went through a health scare this last year, but surgery took care of it, so I'm healthy again, and hopefully have a few more years. I'm 74, 9/12.
Well, I
Going
like for
75.
you
So
plan
I'm
to come
not
back.
young, but if I can have 10 or 15 more years, that'll be good.
Plan to come back every year if you would, because I think that we are tremendously enriched by this kind of research, and it's far too rare for us to find somebody that is doing such pioneering work in an area that is, I think, so productive.
Well, thank you. Yes, and as far as this map is concerned, I was hoping when I was young that I would have time to get to this language family and do it as thoroughly as I have done Uto-Aztecan and some of these other language families and Quechua and so forth. But time goes by faster than I can go, and so I'm not sure if I'll get to them or not.
I understand very well. I would like to put a request to Lynn and Philip Harper. I appreciate your comments last week and this week, but I didn't have an email by which to contact you. And so if you'd see to it that we get an email connection with Robert Cook or with me directly, I would appreciate it, just because I would like to be able to thank you for your contribution. And I thank everyone for your contribution tonight. It's been a very productive session in my view. So good night. The Lord is watching o'er you.
I don't know.
Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you all.
Lynn, do you know how to put things in the chat?
Yeah, I'm doing that right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, it tells us
It's coming to Paul.
Oh,